Hi, I'm Justin Moorman.
And I'm Katie Thornton, and this is the Re-Education of Schools podcast,
where we have open, honest conversations about how to better understand social-emotional learning, trauma-informed care, the whys behind student behavior, and how to help kids navigate it all as they go through school and life. All right, welcome to the podcast. We're back to episode 1. The first one. Butterfly effect, why the shift is occurring.
Yep.
I think that's the good first question, isn't it? Like, what is happening?
What in the world is
What's happening and why? And we'll have all the answers to that.
Yeah, it'll be no problem.
28 minutes from now, you'll be like, now I get it all.
Yeah, this is
the whole thing.
This is it.
So we're really, what we're seeing, because we do have to get into it. We can't just joke around the whole time.
Yeah.
What we're seeing is that there's a change in education and what's being expected. What's your, first of all, what's your take on what that shift is?
Yeah.
And then kind of why is it shifting?
Yeah, I think what's happening is that, the saying, when you know better, you do better, right?
Yeah.
And so now I feel like brain research has now just caught up with the education system, and we're starting to see an influence of actually the old ways we were doing stuff. There's actually research that supports that actually wasn't best for kids.
Sure.
So we're making a shift, I think, through that lens. I also think there's some federal and state laws that are influencing our work right now through the MTSS process, that we're looking more through children through a holistic view. So we're looking at social, emotional, behavioral, and academics, where teachers traditionally were academics, right? The other two components were up to families and school administration to deal with. And now classroom teachers, we're looking at kids, encompassing it all.
Yeah, I think when I was thinking about this shift and why, I just kept thinking we're just like you said, we're learning more, right? And as we learn more, we hopefully end up doing better. And I think the part of what we're seeing is that as this shift happens, right? You have to have an understanding of all of it. We have such little background as educators, I feel like, coming into teaching. So much is focused on actual teaching. And so even though we have a good idea of how we learn as educators, how we shift, we've always kind of done that in the world of academics, like you said. It hasn't been about the core of a person, I guess, if that's how you want to describe it. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that, I guess? What are your...
Yeah, I think we have to, so much of the academic of why kids are learning, right? We know we need to get them in their prefrontal cortex, to that green zone, that ready to learn, but we've never, in a teacher college, right? We've both been in almost 20 years. Teachers' colleges were not teaching you how to regulate kids to get them up to their upstairs brain so they could actually access the learning. We've always looked at those kids. Those kids they've been identified in special education. They've been removed from the classroom. We were wondering why kids aren't making progress, but never really until now are we really diving in saying, well, we're not actually in a spot in our brain that we actually can learn, and we're learning more about that now.
Yeah.
So teachers are developing tools and having to think and process through that on how to get kids ready to learn.
Sure. So you mentioned, you kind of mentioned MTSS, and you mentioned some school law, and just be real. It's not my wheelhouse. I probably should know more about it than what I do, but it's really not. What are some of the things? Because in my world and in the education world in general, there's a weird combination, right? Of some stuff is federal, some stuff is state, some stuff is more just district wide. How do you see that playing out? I guess, or what are some of the things that are across the board in the United States that we know versus just state or district specifics?
Well, I think we can go back to restraint and seclusion law. This is kind of where the hub of all of it starts, right? Yeah. So what we know was happening is that we were overusing restraint and seclusion in schools, particularly with certain socioeconomic, racial groups. They were being, the use of the data has come out, restraint and seclusion was up for those groups. We also were over-identifying those students in special education chronically.
Sure.
So I think it starts there, and that has impacted a lot of other laws that are going to come out after that. So we've seen the misuse of restraint and seclusion, where we've had kids that have been injured or death, right, in school communities.
Some extreme stuff.
Yeah, some extreme stuff. And we also are using it for compliance, right? You're not going to listen, so I'm going to impose my adult will on you and physically going to make you do this or put you in this seclusion room so that it's just going to happen, right? Yeah. Or let's go...
like a grab for control.
Yeah,
right? I've got to have it under control. Yeah. So this is what I have to do now. Yeah.
And those are some more extreme cases, but let's just think about us growing up in school when we were there, that those kids were just set up to the
How
office.
long ago was that? How long ago were we?
Not that long ago.
We don't have time to go into that in this podcast. So yeah, so we're
just very young. So, but like kids were sent up to the office and they just spent the day in the office, right? Well, now we're knowing that kids sitting in a separate room up in the office, that's actually seclusion. We've secluded them from their opportunity for education, right? And we know that breaks relationship practices and actually does not improve the learning outcomes for kids.
Yeah.
So a lot of the restraint and seclusion law is kind of, I think, where it starts.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, like even talking about something that specific, because I think we had kind of trained ourselves in education world, school world, to kind of think like, oh, well, that's like a really effective thing because now I'm not dealing with that issue.
The rest of the kids
as a classroom teacher, I'm not dealing with an issue. The rest of the kids are learning. All important things, but like, well, not necessarily they're not dealing with the issue thing. That is kind of an important thing.
Yeah.
But like we would do that and then we'd say, well, it's working. But then we would realize like the same kids going down to the office 46 times, in a semester. And so is it really that effective? And who is it working for?
Yeah.
Is it working for the other kids in the class and the teacher, or is it working for that kid who obviously was having the issues?
And those, the documentary, The Kids We Lose, right?
Yeah.
That's all about restraint and seclusion. This is exactly what, if you haven't seen that documentary, awesome.
Good
Dr.
one.
Ross Green's, organization has put that out about restraint and seclusion law. But really the kids, we've lost them, right? Because we know those kids, the pipeline to prison is a real thing. We have lots of research out there for the zero tolerance policies, which is not helping serving or correcting anything within our education system. And it's not helping those kids actually access an education and improve their lives.
Yeah.
So if we're really about the kids, if we're wise back there and about serving them, then we have to go back to how can we best help support them within the classroom. And I think that's kind of where restraint and seclusion law started. And every state's different. So some states have gone to 0. Some states it's corporal punishment still happening.
Sure.
And some states they've tightened it up. We're in Ohio and they've put out some things with debriefing and, how many incidents a kid can have before you put plans in place and those kind of things. But each state's going to look a little different.
Don't you think this may be slightly off topic. I don't know.
Yeah.
I guess we make the topics.
Yeah.
So who knows?
Okay.
Maybe it's right on topic. But don't you think it's interesting to watch the reaction? And both of us have been in different places especially when some of this stuff first started coming out a little bit harder. We weren't working in the same district or with each other or anything like that. And it's been interesting for me to watch the reaction from teachers and to gauge my own reaction, right? So again, I was in a separate facility. There are all kinds of tough stuff would happen.
Yep.
It would get very dicey is probably the nice way of saying it, like real quick in like a K through 12 building with kids that had, a lot of issues they were trying to work through. And as stuff started coming out and people started saying, some of these practices are not okay, or they're not what's best, or, you have to really be able to show documentation of this, or, whatever it is. Every next thing that came out, there was almost like a real sense of panic. Like, well, now there's no way we're going to be able to do, there's no way we're going to be able to do this anymore. This whole, pretty much the whole building's going to burn down now because like, there's nothing that we can do. But it's been interesting to watch reactions. And then even within myself, like to gauge my reactions, to be like, okay, like all of a sudden I had to start asking myself, so then what do I do? Yeah. Right. So I can't do X, Y, or Z. This isn't being said it's okay, like legally, whether it was okay before or not. It wasn't, but now legally somebody's telling me that some of these things or some of these practices aren't best. And so what do I do? How do I shift to still reach the kids who need reached and who maybe have lost a little bit of hope? Was that a similar experience for you in a different place? Like, has there been as much? Because again, my experience was a little bit more extreme in that time. But what was your experience like as some of these laws have come out? I mean, and they're still coming out, right?
Yeah, I wore a lot of different hats as things changed. So I was in a restrictive, kids with more significant autism needs, right? And then so not that we're using a lot of restraint and seclusion, because I think as an educator, I was restorative before I knew restorative was a thing to be restorative. Yeah. So those relationships.
Leading the way.
I was leading the way without even knowing.
You're so trendy.
So innovative. But we didn't use a lot of restraint and seclusion. Not that we haven't had times where it always was co-regulating before I knew what co-regulation was, right, in relationship practices. But then going to a gen ed classroom, you have a kid destroy your classroom as a gen ed teacher. You know, what do you do? But it's I think because I had the special education background, I knew to be proactive with some of those plans. But we start seeing some change where people are like, we're pushing all these kids in to inclusion now too, right?
Yeah.
I think as we go through MTSS and PBIS and all those things, we're starting to push kids back into inclusion settings to give them equitable educational opportunities. But we haven't done a real good job educating teachers on how to deal with or what that looks like.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of the premise of why we're here, right? To give people more tools to do that. But then, you know, as a coordinator, I come in when I was overseeing special education services and seeing pockets of people that were really struggling with like, okay, now what do? I can't force the compliance on the kid.
Sure.
So what's the next best thing to do? And how do we do that? And so we've talked a lot in our building through relationship practices and regulation and problem solving with kids.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think you're probably a topic ultimately for a different episode, but like we've seen so many people like kind of over my years I'm going years back, but like I've seen a lot of people then like kind of throw their hands up, you know, and say like, well, what do I do now? So what are some of the things that you feel like some of like maybe one or two like really core things that you feel like we know now in the world of education that maybe it's not brand new information. It existed out there in, you know, brain science world, psychology world, you know, who knows where, but that we're just now catching up to. What are like a couple things maybe that we know now that we didn't a handful of years ago that's kind of driving this change?
Yeah, I think how the brain is organized and structured from learning. I think Dr. Perry's work, obviously, hugely influential within education about just the sequential model of how kids think, learn, organize. Mammals, not even kids, just mammals are organized and learn, and things that kids need to actually feel a sense of safety and belong. We keep on saying, well, they have to feel safe, sense of belonging, just love them. What does that actually mean and why?
Yeah. And when I think like we can really have pushback then on like, well, I'm not unloving to the kids in my class, right? Because people aren't like, right? When no teacher, hopefully no teacher is like in a room and is like, man, I'm going to show all these guys today. Like, you know, like I'm going to really stick it to them. Like they come in and they love kids, right? That's why you're doing a job like this. And so I think that there's that aspect of, you know, teachers really feeling then like I'm failing at loving a kid is what I'm being told because the kid's not getting any better. But what we really weren't doing is giving like all of the science kind of behind it. And there's this shock. It's shocking how little like science kind of brain, like this is how the human brain works. There's some when we're going through, and we talked about that earlier, but like some when we're going through school and such, but you're so inundated with everything else that then all of a sudden you're a new teacher in a classroom, or you went through school 22 years ago and whatever they did have to pass on back then is so different, or we know so much more now. And I'm sure there are ultimately probably whole podcasts out there like dedicated just to this idea of how the brain works and how different that is and how that impacts not just students, not just kids, but all of us, me, you, like you said, mammals in general, all people.
Yeah.
We're all being impacted by this. And the more that we can understand about it, I think the better off we are. But that's hard. You know, it's hard to come up with all of that.
Yeah. And I think we assume changing behavior because I think we want kids to do well in our class, right?
Sure.
And the whole saying kids do well if they can, right?
Yeah.
And I think because we've removed them or we have put punishments in place, right, and we're not seeing the output, it's kind of like that sense of giving up because we don't know what to do. I think disciplinary practices, we know if we want to change student behavior, we know how that needs to happen now, and it's not an easy fix.
Yeah.
We know.
Yeah, it's not quick.
It's not quick, and it takes time, and I know we'll talk more in depth about that in other episodes, but I think we're also seeing a shift in vocabulary development within our education system where,
that's a good point.
Like, where teachers can say, the kid's not regulated, or I was trying to co-regulate with a kid, right? I think we'll talk more about making those shifts in your building, but I think we're learning more about actually some practices of getting kids regulated to be able to reason with them.
Yeah.
Which
I think even with like talking about the brain and stuff, I know again, whether it's Bruce Perry or other people, like that's part of the goal too. Like when we're all using different words to try to describe the same thing. And we get it. Like there's all a business side to education too, right? Yeah. So people are constantly trying to sell something to schools and to districts and to states even as like, this is going to be your answer. And so then what happens though, is we all end up saying different kinds of things instead of being really on the same page. And I think that's where some of the trainings I've had, some of the work that I've, looked into, and I know you have as well, like what we find is if we break it down to like just like the actual things, like what are the parts of the brain and how does that work in your brain? That's going to translate across the board instead of, having some, whatever, I get weird about like cutesy funny, right? Like some cutesy funny, like little word
acronym
for,
whatever.
like whatever. It's a little gimmicky kind of thing, which is fine. I'm not saying those things never work or they have no place, but they have no place with me. No, but no, they just don't, they just don't land. And it leaves a lot of misinterpretation. Like, I think that can happen a lot, misinterpretation.
What's the saying? Like, it's not programs that are going to fix people, it's people that are going to fix people. So if we want to...
I don't think I've ever heard that saying, but that's a good one. Did you make it up? Or
maybe right now. Somebody quote me on that.
Hurry. Copyright that.
But we know like people can support and help people. There's not a magic program that you're saying, my school's going to adopt this, whatever. Because ultimately, all the underlying great school programs have the same philosophical belief. It's restorative, it's neuroscience based, and it's about relationship practices with kids and how do you establish that.
Do you sorry, I didn't interrupt you, but like, do you feel like now in the position you've been in the last handful of years, whether like in more administrative, do you feel like you have a better understanding now of why people that are in administration are quick to, it's going to sound really negative, but like quick to like grab for a program that is being told to them, this will work and this will solve the problems?
I think it just goes back to same thing with teachers, right? Administrators are no different. The education of the why. So this program, I don't have the confidence, the vocabulary, the deep understanding of how this actually all works. So if I get this program, that will be a guide or a map on how to lead. For the parts that I really don't feel 100% confident that I could kind of write the script myself, right?
Sure. Yeah.
And so I think that's where we ultimately land. And not those things are not bad, but I do think it goes back to the professional development, the research, and really having a strong understanding of why that program is effective for your school or not. Because I think if your teachers don't have that, the program will never land.
Yeah. That's what I always have thought. Like, and then, or what happens if that program goes away, or what happens if there's no longer, now you can't purchase that program anymore. They went under, right?
Yeah.
So then what? Like now what do you do? And that's always something that's on my mind, is like to try to, you can see some of the best results and some of the most effective things are things that aren't just going to go away. And part of what's not going to go away, again, is people, right?
Yeah.
And realizing that people are what ends up making the difference. We as educators and our relationships with kids are what ends up making the difference. But that's an intimidating thing because it's ambiguous enough that it's not going to be somebody hands you the sheet and you just have to read off of it and now you get the results that you're being told. So that's a whole probably another conversation for another day. But yeah, I think that's interesting. And I was kind of curious your take on that as an administrator.
Well, as an educator, what do you think about the shift in educators' state of mind, or like the shift of educators now being kind of responsible for the connection with behavior, right? Like we're looking at their nervous system, right?
Yeah, I think it's intimidating. Yeah. Right. I think there's a lot of people that are very intimidated and feel ill-equipped. I think in education, we've talked about this before, not on a podcast, right? A lot, but I think a lot of educators fall in a certain personality.
Yeah.
They're probably, not always, but probably going to be more the people that had a really great school experience themselves.
Yeah.
That means they probably fit in 10, 20, 30 years ago to how school was very well, with somebody standing up and presenting something to them and then them doing work and then them turning it in. Like they thrived in that. I was somebody that like that the system worked really well for me and my personality and how I learned and what I could do. But there's huge percentages of people out there who it's not best for. So I think we have these people that go into education expecting to just emulate what someone did with them. Yeah. Right. And so now all of a sudden you're here. I think it's partly, I do think this is partly why we have a lot of people potentially leaving education too. Yeah. Because now all of a sudden they're thinking and they're being told the thing that worked for you and that you would be really comfortable emulating. Not even just that you'd be good at it, but that the thing that you're comfortable with is not what we're asking you to do anymore.
Yeah.
Now we're asking you to do something that's different and that's a little bit more fluid and ambiguous.
Yep.
And that's really concerning to a lot of people. And then when they don't see really, we love in education, we love seeing results quick, right?
Yeah.
And even we talk about this like in, when we're talking about academic kind of progress and stuff, we're like, oh, well, it might take a few weeks, might take a quarter or whatever. Well, we're talking years potentially, depending on the kid here. And so we're all of a sudden realizing that, the poor second grade teacher may not see the fruits of their labor.
Yep. Until
that kid's in 5th grade. But that they had such an integral part in that. But I think that, so it's intimidating. I think it's very intimidating, and I think it makes teachers sometimes feel like they're failing because it's not quick. It's not a quick fix.
Yeah, and I think we keep, and this will probably be a whole other episode, but
right, there's so
talking about the...
Are we writing down what episodes should be?
Episode 29 will be, but thinking about the other kids in the classroom, right? And they'll say, we're inclusion movement, right? Having everybody put into classrooms and giving equitable opportunities within public ed. But then thinking about other kids within my classroom, I think we hear that a lot too.
Yeah,
and making that shift. But I think building strong communities and starting your day off and creating a community of acceptance. And we've seen some teachers do it exceptionally well.
Sure.
Where it's just knowing what other kids need and continuing to develop that within our own school communities and classrooms.
So there's a lot of shifts happening. That's really what we're saying. There's a lot of shifts happening. And I think that's always scary, again, to educators. It's scary to administrators too. Also educators. I think that it's anytime stuff is changing, it's intimidating, it's scary, no matter what world you live in. But part of the question I think that gets asked a lot is that because kids are changing? Have kids changed?
I don't think kids have changed. I think what we know about kids have changed. I think we're having more honest conversations about our school communities.
Yeah.
I think things from when we were in school, we have the internet. Things are televised at any drop. So I think we know more about family communities and culture.
Yeah.
I think there's systematic things that have happened even within the United States that are where people that maybe never knew are way more aware now.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's necessarily that kids have changed. I think we are now cross-integrating within our schools. And so we might see kids that maybe traditionally didn't happen in our cute little suburb, right? Yeah. That's just my thoughts.
Yeah, no, I kind of thought the same thing. I thought, I don't know that it's actually kids themselves that are changing, but I think the world around kids has changed a lot. And I think that always is going to be true, right? And so I'm always careful because this is always reality. Right. Every generation is like, well, this is the first time it's ever been like this. Stuff shouldn't have changed. This was the best, whatever. Now things are way worse than when I was a kid. That we all land there. Like that's all partly a thing. But I think if you look at how many things quickly changed, technology drastically has changed in the last 30 years. A lot, 30, 40 years, there's a big difference. And I think that one of the things I was thinking about too is just you have a higher percentage of kids that are living in single families, single parent families now. You have the ability to have your kid, my kids do it, your kids do it. We have the ability to have our kids be on a device and look at something and be able to be entertained or to be able to even learn, even good things that are there. But what that suddenly loses, because as I was thinking about this, I kept thinking, well, what's really different? Because it's not like my parents, love my parents, great parents, but it's not like my parents were hanging out with me all the time when I was in 4th or 5th grade. I was out with friends in my neighborhood running around on the streets back and forth, playing whatever. We were kind of on our own. I was like, so that's not necessarily a giant shift. But I started thinking, I wonder how much less that happens and how much more somebody is inside doing something on a screen or doing something individually. And so while they may be engaged with something that might even be good, they're engaged with something that is not another person. And we know so much about relationships and how important they are and how many times we now potentially, because of how things have changed around kids, now how many times are kids not in an active relationship with a person, but are maybe engaged in other ways with their time.
Where they're making their own choice, their own they're not having to compromise, comply.
Or collaboration in what we're going to play today.
Yeah, that's so true. I didn't think about like just going out and those neighborhood conflicts, right? Like the neighborhood tussle, or like who was on whose team, right? Like those navigation things are not happening. I don't think kids are out playing as much, and that makes a lot of sense. Like,
so it's not even just relationships with adults. I mean, because that's important. That's drastically important. But like, I think that there's also the relationships with each other, and I think that's also why, even as far as the academics of it all go, like there's more of a push to be like, well, let's not just stand up in front, teachers, and deliver a lecture and then expect the kids to do, but like they should be doing a lot more together. Again, that's actually way more of your world and understanding than it is mine. But I think that's part of that, right? Is this idea of how we work together and how the relationship of learning really works.
And the need for explicit SEL instruction within our schools. And those interpersonal student-to-student interactions, self-guided hands-on learning is essentially what I know in our state, at least, it's what we're called for in terms of what we're looking for in classrooms for teachers.
Yeah.
So,
believe it or not, we are at a spot where we probably need to say, like,
what
is it that we really want people to walk away from? Yeah. Like, what do we want people to know who are listening to this conversation?
Yeah, I would say, just going back to the idea of like the butterfly effect, right? Like even though there is changes that are happening in education, it's not the same when I first started teaching, and it's not the same when I went to school. But one small impact in your classroom, it will start having that ripple effect within your school community, within your district. So just be patient, be calm, be willing to listen, and think about some of these things, because it ultimately comes back to the kids and loving them through this, and giving them equitable educational opportunities, and how can we best support them. Right?
I just keep thinking, like, this isn't happening just because. I think sometimes in education, just in my experience so far, we always say, like, you don't like this math program, wait around 3 years, right? It doesn't matter. Don't like the reading direction we're going, wait around 2 or 3 years. Don't like the approach of this, wait around 2 or 3 years, and it'll change. It feels so frequently in education like we change just because.
Yeah.
And I think what's important to walk away from in a conversation like this, to me, is that this isn't a just because kind of change. This is a change that's backed by a lot of research. It's backed by a lot of new understanding. And as we're kind of blurring the lines between professions and people who are experts in different professions, that's really what's happening, right? We're learning more from people that aren't in education, which is what probably should have been happening all along.
Right.
And then people hopefully in other professions are learning like what we do in education and how their profession can speak to what we do. So there's a lot more crossover, I think, than what there used to be. This isn't just because, right? This is something that's happening like very purposefully. And hopefully, I think people can start seeing that just even in a short conversation like this, like there's a lot happening, which can be overwhelming, right? Mm-hmm. Feel overwhelmed. That's all right.
Yeah.
Like it's all right to feel overwhelmed. But know that if you don't start, then you're never going to make any progress.
Yeah.
We're never going to find ourselves in the right spot.
It's essential. If we want kids to learn, we have to know how the brain works.
Yeah.
And that's the bottom line.
And that's what we're going to be talking about a lot more.
Yeah.
A lot more, hopefully. But we just wanted to start, right? By saying like, this is kind of why this is all going on.
We see it, we feel it, we're living it every day.
Yeah. It's uncomfortable.
And I think that's a future episode. Like it's uncomfortable work and it's hard and it's an emotional work.
Yeah.
But you're right, it's research-based, it's best practices, and it's not going away. Yeah. We can't unlearn what we know now.
Yeah. So. Yeah, we're just negligent at some point if we don't start acting.
Yeah.
Well, we appreciate you guys joining us and being a part of the conversation. You know, we look forward to having you guys jump back in on our next episode as well.
Yeah.
And hopefully you find it helpful. Man, ask us questions, give us comments. We love all that, and it's going to really help us drive where we're going.
Yeah.
And I think what we do next, right?
Yeah.
As educators and on this podcast specifically.
Yeah. We're going to go back and do the work, right?
Yep. Let's go out there and do it.
Yep.